Hel- Hello, and welcome to the very first reading of a collection of short stories of the Lost Old Ones by H.J Bendele. Please make yourself comfortable. Ignore that odd sound of something wet rising from the water, and begin to prepare yourself to enjoy the story called Drowned, All I Loved. We will begin. So many stories are told, and so few are taken to heart. I wished I took those stories to heart, the ones about the lead weights crafted in the image of the tentacled monster. My family was born into the sea. Fishermen raised by a fisherman. Raised by a fisherman, as far as any can tell. Long, long ago, we were the greatest fishermen of the coast, the Tul'dnka family. My family was the best with the help of the sea. The sea is not always kind, and I have a wife and son to feed. Not a single fish has been caught and brought ashore this whole year, and we head into autumn. My father trained me well, and I was a good fisherman of my own right, but I, nor any other ship on the sea, came to a good harvest. You must understand the desperation of a man who watches his family thin out of hunger. You must know why I did this. Not for greed or want of money, but survival. So we could eat. The old tales my family told came along with an old chest, locked and sealed. The lock was no match for the desperate swing of a fine axe. The old heavy chest opened to show a large collection of weights. What I first thought were weights for casting a net, I soon knew was what the stories were about. There was no mistaking those lead feelers and those horrid carved eyes. These were the weights from the stories, the weights of sacrifice. I was desperate. I would try anything just to feed my family, and I knew the stories. The weights must be attached to something loved, something cared for by someone. I knew just the thing. My father left many trophies, and I collected some myself. Stuffed and mounted record-setting fish. No one would buy them, as those records have been broken many times over, but I loved them. My father loved them. The day I set out to sea, with nets and sacrifice in tow, I first tried my father's first fish. I attached the bluish-gray, squid-like weight, and nearly shed a tear as I dropped the fish my father told me so many stories about. I found 4 fish in my net that day. We ate, and where it was not much, for us it was a feast. The next day I sunk my first fish, and 3 other trophies of my own, and I filled my net. Now we could eat for days. News of my catch got around, and many came to buy our fish. The fish was fresh, sweet, and good. I begun to like fishing again, but not just fishing. The sacrifice begun to grow on me, even call to me. On the 3rd day, I felt the need to sacrifice all of the trophies, and I filled my net 3 times over. The overwhelming amount of harvest brought my family wealth, and we did not go hungry. The sea still called for sacrifices, and so, with my wealth, I brought gold and jewels, and with the weight I sacrificed them as well. This time, the fish did not come so easily, as we made a little less than the day before. My desire grew more, but it felt like it was not mine. A cold and salty fog rolled in that night and filled my head as I slept. I dreamt of the sea. In my dream, I was on my boat, fishing in the dead of night, far from the eye of the day's sun. I looked back at land and found that it was not in sight, nor were there any lands to the port or starboard side. I looked to the skies to navigate, with the stars only. I looked to the skies to navigate with the stars, only to find dark, blue, and black sky, void of all stars. This image was frightening, bringing me awe and fear. That fear floated over when the water began to rise in my boat. The boat filled and filled until I was left drifting alone in an empty sea, with nothing but the bucket I was using in vain to bail out my boat. I felt something wrap around my ankle, something much like seaweed or kelp. I begun to sink, splashing, kicking, screaming, dragged me down. I screamed so much, struggled so much, as my head was pulled underwater, with only the empty bucket remaining on the water's still surface. The light of the moon reflected and bent under the water, painting the sky more beautiful than I first saw. The deeper I got, the darker the water was, and more kelp and seaweed I saw. More kelp wrapped around me, dragging me below even faster. Before I knew it, I was on the sandy ground of the sea, surrounded by the towering kelp. Still wrapped in tendrils of kelp myself. It is this moment that I realized that I was not drowning. A voice crept into my head, shook my whole body and soul. Tih'tulkd, it said, slowly and bluntly. Tih'tulkd. You send down trophies. You love trophies. I give gifts. You send shiny. None love shiny. I like shiny. I give less gift. Send me what is love. I give more gifts. I hunger for what is loved. Suddenly, I awoke, stumbling out of my bed, coughing and starting to vomit as I reached the highway. The vomit was salty, briny seawater. I climbed the stairs to my attic, where the lead weights and old books my father left were kept. With a rusty old lantern in my hand, I looked through the books, searching for something I thought I read as a child, until I found it. Tih'tulkd, the highest elder priest of Dun, the elder god of the deep water, all creatures aquatic, and those that drowned. Currently the entity responsible for handling the sacrifices of Dun, until the elder god is free once again. This is what the passage said. An old journal from an elder that was said to meet the sea after he spoke out about the sacrifice. Most of the pages were ripped and made unreadable after this passage, and this was the only mention of Tih'tulkd. I had a knot in my stomach, but despite that feeling and the ominous passage, I still felt drawn to sacrifice. In the morning, I brought one small cattle from a local farm. Was told that it was well loved and cared for. In the sea, many lead weights were strapped to this small cattle. At first, I could not bring myself to cause this living creature to drown. But then I felt a sudden desire for the reward, and I do not know if it came from myself. In a sudden lurch, I felt myself shove the creature off the side. And it did not take long for it to sink, as the lead weights did the job. That day I towed in barges full of fish, more than any one man has ever fished. I felt pride within myself, knowing that I pleased Tih'tulkd, that I pleased Dun. For the next week, every morning, I would travel out for my fishing town. For next week, every morning, I would travel out of my fishing town, each time to a new farm, and purchase a well-loved cattle. And for the week, that was enough. I caught more fish than ever recorded before. But then the hunger of what dwelled beneath grew. It wanted a bigger sacrifice. It came to me in my sleep again. This time I woke up, only to find where I woke to be dark and foggy. I stood up and wandered around the field of darkness, and after a short while I noticed the way the ground felt like wet sand, and how things floated. I saw a light before me, a warm yellowish light, and it came to me. As I got closer and closer, I noticed a shadow behind the light. But it was not until it was in reach that I could see the toothy face of a twisted-looking anglerfish, which quickly shifted its path to avoid me. I knew for certain that I was underwater. A part of me felt excited. I was going to hear the words of the highest elder priest again, but I couldn't help the feeling that this too was not my feelings, that something put those feelings there. I spotted the tendrils of kelp floating up, ready to drag wherever it wanted down to the bottom of the floor, and I heard the voice again. Pleased, it said, slowly and brutishly, very pleased. Good sacrifices, good rewards. Ready. You are ready. Give one last sacrifice. Give highest sacrifice. I felt an urge, a compulsion. I knew what it wanted me to sacrifice. My own kin. My own son. I can't do that. My own son? But it draws me to. It calls me to. I must make the highest sacrifice I could for my family. It needed to be done. The thought of the whole fishing town came to mind. Somehow I knew the sacrifice meant this town would never again go hungry for fish. That they would always be fed. If I didn't do this last sacrifice, then no one would ever see a fish again. In the morning, I brought down all the weights I had left. Just enough to sink one person. I got a suitable harness and took the last sacrifice I would ever give onto the sea in my boat. The weights were tied to the harness. The harness tightly fitted. The last sacrifice I would ever make hit the surface of the water. I hit the surface of the water. I could not sacrifice my own son, not only because I did not have the heart of an unloving monster, but because I could never go home again. I also knew that my son would not be the end. Not really. I sank into the sea, breathing my last breath, hoping no one would know what I did. Okay, thank you very much for attending this reading of Drowned, All That I Loved. This was written by myself, H.J Bendele. This was an unedited, rough read. I appreciate you joining me tonight on... what's the thing I usually call it? Emo Boy and the Spooks? How about we just call it Reading of the Eldritch? Yeah, that sounds good. Reading of the Eldritch. Thank you very much for my first ever episode of Reading of the Eldritch. Please subscribe, like, and comment if you can. And join me next Friday for another reading. Have a lovely evening. Have a spooky evening.